started before we start? Got some water?
Yes, please.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to this second session of our morning at the ConservativeHome Future Jobs Conference. We've got a fantastic panel lined up to talk about some of the political and policy aspects of the issues we're here to talk about today. I'm your chairman for this session, Mark Wallace, the Chief Executive of ConservativeHome. And we're very fortunate to be joined for this discussion by Jack Lopresti MP, the Vice Chair of the Conservative Party for Policy, by Jade Marsden, who fought the Conservative Liverpool was the Conservative candidate for the Liverpool City Region mayoralty in 2021, and Matthew Elliott, who's a senior political advisor at Shore Capital and a serial political campaigning entrepreneur. I think it's fair to say the TaxPayers Alliance, through to Big Brother Watch, and of course Vote Leave. So the topic of this session is the question of a workers' party, getting the right policy for enterprise and jobs. We can all remember, even through the kind of time and chaos-induced fog of the last couple of years, what happened in that momentous election in 2019. That moment when the Conservative Party won the popular vote in every single socio-economic group. That included retaining, amid some challenges, some of its a victory among its traditional core vote, but it also involved remarkable historic incursions into the working class vote in every part of the country. And there was already, I think, post referendum, a rising swell of this idea that there was a twin opportunity presented for conservatism. Firstly, to take advantage of what was a political realignment, making people perhaps consider for the first time whether to return to voting, had they given up on politics, or to switch their vote away from from what might be their traditional allegiance to the Labour Party. The second opportunity, of course, played off the first, which was frankly the breakdown of some of that relationship under Corbynism. That question of values and economics both being reassessed at the same time by a swing population who, the shorthand for whom has become the Red Wall. Now, as we all know, that's not a perfect read across. It's not a defined and fixed group in all circumstances. But the question here we have today is, 2.5 years on, mid-term from that remarkable 2019 election, what is the prospect for the Conservative Party as the Workers' Party? How far has it come in creating that brand? What are its opportunities to capitalise on it and develop it further? What are the challenges? And as I said in my opening remarks at the very start of this morning, what will the decision be in working people's minds come the next election of whether they're aware that policy and politics combined have actually created for them or not created for them the real opportunities for the multiplicity of high quality, well paid, well supported and sustainable jobs. So without further ado from me, I hope you'll join me in welcoming our first speaker, Jack Lopresti.
Well, thank you very much. Excuse me, and thank you for having me. I want to thank our sponsors. I've got to declare an interest in having a big Amazon operation in my constituency with lots of highly skilled, very well-paid jobs, distributing wonderful things. As far as the general discussion goes, I'm not entirely sure that we witnessed a realignment as such at the last election. I mean, there were some unique factors as far as the logjam we were in with Brexit, sort of Groundhog Day we kept going through, and that needed to be broken and got through. But when I was first interested in politics seriously in the mid-80s, you know, we had the working person's demographic, we had the aspirational voter, we had somebody who was blue collar, who wanted their own home, wanted to buy shares or even start their own business. So I'm not sure things have changed that radically, but obviously it will be interesting and a challenge for us, especially post-pandemic, to try and keep those people on side, manage the economy, and give them a further reason to vote for us next time around. So that's, and for me, I mean, I'm working class, left school at 50. I sort of exemplify the sort of aspirational aspect of Conservative Party politics. You didn't mention housing, which I think is a huge challenge in our country, and you know, touches pretty much every aspect of public policy: healthcare, education, well-being, and even connectivity as far as getting to your workplaces. And I don't think, as a country, we're having a proper discussion about that yet, to be honest. But I'm sure we will in due course. Yes, I am one of the many vice chairmen of the party, but apparently in charge of policy. I've been warned off a couple of times and told that I'm not responsible for writing the party's policy. I'm more of a conduit, so I gather information, have meetings with CPS. We have these backbench groups in Parliament which basically touch on every aspect of policy, and I feed that all through. So I'm looking forward to this discussion. Interesting and fascinating, and I can guarantee it will be fed back through into writing our manifesto and formulating policy.
Thank you very much, Jack. Our second speaker this morning, as I mentioned, is Jade Marsden. Now, it's very easy in these magnificent surroundings or in an online discussion for us to talk about ideas just for the sake of talking about ideas. It's a very enjoyable thing to do. I'm a journalist. You've all learned by now in the morning I like the sound of my own voice. So do many of us. It's very easy for us to talk just about the concept of policy, or indeed to start allocating and modelling the kind of financial and economic impact. Actually getting out on the doorstep to fight an election on the front line, to have that conversation face to face with people, as Jack and your colleagues do as parliamentarians. It's at that point you find out whether something is hot air or whether it really makes a difference or not. And that's why we're very, very fortunate that Jade Marsden's joined us, particularly informed by her own campaigning experience, I say, in the Liverpool city region. So please welcome Jade.
Thanks, Mark, and thanks to everybody taking part in this discussion today. One of the things I did before being the mayoral candidate for the Liverpool city region was stand in one of the safest Labour seats in the country. It's also one of the most deprived. It's one of the areas where people have got a low life expectancy. What you notice is that the rest of the region is thriving. It's growing at an incredible pace. The employment is rising. Then you look at this area and there's this pocket where people are still dying young, people still have really poor health outcomes, and we have to look at these areas and ask, why is policy that's doing well around the country not helping these people in these areas? So we recently got the Freeport status, which will be utilised hugely. The Docklands are thriving, but the local people are not being employed in this area. So one of the questions I'd really like to, put forward to people and try and get some kind of discussion going on is, how can we help these people feel part of society? Because right now they feel removed from the rest of the country that's really successful. There is huge issues surrounding, families. There's no youth clubs. How I think we need to really engage with these people is to invest in them from a young age, get them involved and show them that they don't have to follow the same path that their parents or their parents followed. They're on probably the fourth generation of unemployment in their families, and we need to break that cycle.
Thank you. A really interesting point there in particular about a reminder, as I said in the introduction, that the question of a job or a person in or out of a job is not just a standalone question. No man is an island, as John Donne put it, and that particularly where you have a wider social context or indeed an issue of persistent unemployment within a family, a multi-generational basis, something that I think we've heard multiple Conservative governments over the last 12 years really try and wrangle with. It'd be very interesting to get some of the audience's perspectives on that too. Now our third panellist, Matthew Elliott, as I mentioned earlier, perhaps best known as a campaigner, particularly with a serial ability. I declare an interest. I used to work for him at the TaxPayers Alliance. A serial ability to get not just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 steps and moves ahead of where the ground-swelling political issues are going to go, often long before Westminster quite realises what's hit it, be it on that question of taxpayer value, civil liberties, the EU referendum and Brexit. And now, I know, Matthew, you've been doing a lot of work exploring attitudes to business and work among the wider electorate. Matthew Elliott.
I have. Thank you, Mark. And I think one thing worth considering with this question is the different economic climate that we now have right now compared to 2019, where at the time things were quite benign economically, but now we're facing a really tough cost of living crisis. I was speaking to one friend who's a city economist yesterday and asking him to sort of give me an idea of the scale of the sort of crisis that we're fighting. I said, is it a bit like 2007, 2008, the financial crisis, or perhaps like the early 1990s? And he was actually saying that what we're facing and about to go through could be as big as what countries like Spain and Greece and the Baltics went through with the Eurozone crisis some years ago. So it could be a big contraction of 10% plus to the economy. So a huge crisis about to come. And the reason why this is important is that because when you have that sort of situation, there might be a temptation in politics to kick the nearest thing, which could be business, and engage in quite sort of anti-business rhetoric to try and find somebody who can pay for some of the services that we need. And I would say that would be a big mistake. We've got to make sure that we don't kill the goose that lays the golden economic eggs. And if we think about the role of business in society, it helps in a number of ways. If you think about the payment of public services, for example. Margaret Thatcher used to like to say how there's no such thing as government money, only taxpayers' money. And you can actually add on the third element to that. There's no such thing as government money, only taxpayers' money, and all those tax pounds are generated by businesses at some point. So we've got to make sure that we nurture the business community of that. And also nurturing the business community for the provision of jobs, which of course help us with our prosperity, our household prosperity, and also our general prosperity as a country. So I would say that the trouble when you think about the Conservative Party as purely a workers' party, as some people sort of almost try and say we should be purely a workers' party, that could be almost quite divisive. It's quite us versus them. It's the workers versus business. I would prefer to see it in a much more holistic way, perhaps more of the sort of one nation tradition of the party, where you actually recognise that yes, there's a role for business, there's a role for workers, there's a role for all aspects in society. We've all got to work together. So my big opening thought would be, don't be too divisive in how we see a society, don't split away the workers from business.
Thank you very much. I'm actually going to use that as the basis for my first question, where we do, I'm pleased to say, have plenty of time for audience questions. A roving microphone, so if I do pick you for a question, please wait for it to reach you so the audience at home can hear you. Please do say who you are and where you're from, and if you say the dread words, it's more of a comment than a question. I will literally boo you until you have to sit back down. So for everyone's benefit and the general betterment of society. But my own first question is inspired really by what Matthew was just talking about. Is there a tension between being a workers' party and a party of business? Someone known to many of us allegedly once said the words F business to a family audience at Conservative Home's YouTube channel. Jack, is there a tension between us? Do we need to choose one or the other?
No.
Is there a danger in
I
being
don't
forced into that?
see or hear or pick up any narrative like that. I think obviously times are difficult. There's a huge amount of money to pay back, which obviously 400 billion spent during the pandemic, and the books have to be balanced. But I don't think anybody's looking for a scapegoat. Though I do agree with the general point, you have to be careful if you squeeze the wealth creators, the taxpayers, the businesses too much, it can have obviously a detrimental effect and drive investment away. So I sort of agree with your one nation vision, but I don't think there's any real danger. And the Workers' Party, I mean, that's quite an old-fashioned, outdated concept. I think if you talk to a small business person or a sole trader, they work their socks off. They would consider themselves a worker. So it's an interesting sort of discussion point to stimulate policy ideas, but I don't think it's binary or in any way divisive.
Jade.
I disagree with that from the perspective of people who see their business as some kind of enemy. So in Liverpool, you've got a strong socialist outlook. You've got people who haven't got any money whatsoever, who feel that businesses are taken away from them. And it's how we make that crossover. And there's some businesses that are really successful with, doing social projects and outlooks. So I think the more businesses take social responsibility, it will kind of, detract from that and bring the kind of, the politics of envy down somewhat.
Thank you. Matthew, is that something that politicians can help to fix? Is it something businesses need to act to fix?
I've been doing quite a lot of polling about attitudes towards business recently, and it's quite interesting. People have very positive attitudes about businesses they know locally and ones they can identify with and ones working in their own communities, but are less positive towards some of the bigger sort of multinational businesses, should we say, that are out there. So attitudes vary amongst businesses. Sorry, your question, sorry.
It was in terms of just what Jade was saying, in terms of kind of helping to, say, change some of those, defuse some of those tensions that Jack was warning about, or to change some of those perspectives. Is it something politicians can help to fix? Is it something businesses need to change how they behave to resolve?
I think when you talk about the positives of business, people do see positive aspects. People recognise particularly the provision of jobs is a key one, that people recognise why business is important. People get the idea as well that a lot of the money the government spends come from business. People get that intuitively as well. I think sometimes business isn't actually its own best friend when it comes to actually selling itself. And sometimes some of the virtues that they see in what they do isn't actually what would resonate when it comes to the grassroots level, the constituency level. So a better awareness of that would be good. So yes, businesses do have a role in selling themselves.
Thank you. Now, I say we have plenty of time to kind of bring in questions from the audience. So who would our first question be? The gentleman here, microphone will reach you. It's sneaking up on you. There it is.
Thank you. Philip Virgo, Conservative Policy Forum. How do we do a rather better job of joining up welfare to work programs with the recruitment and career development programs of employers? There's a great gulf there. How do we bridge it? Who should be doing the work, centrally, locally, what have you?
Can I bring in Jack on that? Obviously, as a constituency,
only yesterday the government announced a programme to try and help over 50s back into work, coaching, one-to-one training, the Short Start programme for younger people to start their working careers. So there are already mechanisms and ways to which government and different agencies can work with people who are actively seeking either alternative employment or new employment. So that's already happening. Nobody's mentioned apprenticeships, and I'm a huge advocate of apprenticeships. I mean, believe it or not, since 2010, the government has helped create 5 million apprenticeship programs. And not only is that a fantastic way for young people to start their working careers, get training while they're earning, also older people change careers, whenever, halfway through, whatever. There are fantastic mechanisms for social mobility, for training, and for helping people develop their own careers.
Matthew and Jade.
Interestingly mentioning apprenticeships, in Liverpool docks there's a huge boom in apprenticeships, and it's absolutely amazing to see that, and it's thriving. There's an incredible amount of investment going into the city region. Where the problem falls down with us, again, it boils down to people not having role models to look up to and say, look, this is what you can achieve. So I believe that early intervention, and to bring a bit of an old phrase back up, we need to look at Cameron's big society, get children and young people mobilised from a young age, show them what they can be, what they can aspire to be, and just kind of remove that negativity that's been pumped into them from a very young age. It's doable, but we really do need to be investing in the younger generations from that aspect.
Sure. Next up, gentleman here in the front row.
Thank you. Anthony McKellar from Bedfordshire. I just want to say the term the Workers' Party could be quite divisive. To quote an old phrase, people say going back to the 1970s. To use a phrase like the Workers' Party would be to go back to the 1970s. As one Prime Minister from the time said, one person's pay increase is another person's increased bill. I just wondered, how do we, in policy terms, get around that disparity?
I'm going to put that one straight to Matthew Elliott first. There is this direct tension. It's something we're hearing, obviously, right the way up to the Prime Minister and the Chancellor, talking about, or do the Bank of England, do employers have a responsibility to aid their workers in an inflationary environment? Do they have a wider national responsibility to constrain inflation even at the cost of, say, the quality of living, the quality of life and the cost of living crisis of their employees?
There are no easy answers to this, as I'm sure the government are now facing. We have had some fairly good economic circumstances in the past few years, and now things are changing rapidly. With the pandemic, of course, people thought that the big issue would be widespread unemployment following that. And of course, that didn't happen, not least because of the furlough scheme. But now you have a situation where, frankly, wages aren't going to keep up with where inflation is. And we will see huge tensions there. We're seeing it already with, obviously, the rail strikes a few weeks back. We're seeing issues with the airports at the moment. And I think that will be a running issue over the coming year. And I don't envy the position that the Prime Minister or the Chancellor are in trying to sort of deal with this, trying to get the country through it, because you could get to this situation where you have this wage inflationary cycle.
Jade, this relates to some of what you were just talking about, doesn't it? If you're trying to, say, change a young person's attitude to work or encourage them in terms of their expectations and hopes for the future, if they see the value of what they get in return for working eroded, that's going to become even more of a challenge, isn't it?
It is, but we have to make sure that as a society we see the bigger picture and don't allow ourselves to be dragged into the negativity. It is a really rubbish situation the country's in at the moment. Everybody's going to feel the pinch, but if we kind of sell it as at the end of this, things will improve, things will get better, but we seem kind of in this bubble at the moment where we're just allowing ourselves to be contracted into such bad attitudes. We need to break that and just look forward and look forward to the day that things are a bit cheerier, I suppose.
Jack, the Prime Minister famously said that his goal for Britain was a high-pay economy. We're obviously facing even more challenges to that than might be expected.
Well, it is, as people have said, very difficult because, don't forget that inflation affects the people on lower incomes or fixed incomes disproportionately. I mean, people have mentioned the 1970s. One of my earliest memories of watching politics on the television was Mrs. Thatcher cutting a third off a pound note and saying, in a year when inflation was nearly 30%, what you could buy, has gone up by 30%, basically. It's astonishing. So that obviously has to be dealt with, and it is beginning to seep through into the system. So it is very difficult. Jane talked about role models. I just want to say that I'm always very, very keen. I went to Airbus a couple of weeks ago in my constituency, and the new plant manager started her working life as an apprentice on the shop floor. And I think the more we can get that out there, 30% of the main board of Rolls-Royce started as apprenticeships. One of my friends who runs Boeing Defence UK started as an apprentice. Yeah. Role models, especially for people who grow up in environments where they don't have good role models, let me put it that way, are crucial just to show the way, essentially.
Who else do we have in the room? I can see if we have any more. Over here.
Hello, Terrace Hannah at Alva Partners. So my very little experience of social mobility going state school the whole way through is it's not just a lack of opportunities, but to me, my experience is that there's a huge gap in confidence between, say, children who have a state school, a less privileged upbringing and education than children who have. And going to university, I could see that very clearly. So, first of all, do you agree with that? And secondly, how do we tackle and it's mentioned earlier that lots of children, if their parents never, went to university or stayed in a certain job, then they assume that that's going to be the same for them. So how do we deal with the confidence issue, because I think we can create opportunities, but if people don't feel they have the confidence to do it, or it's not for them, then it's still not going to work.
Jack?
I would agree with all that, actually. I mean, I left school at 16 with no qualifications. I was always fascinated with politics and current affairs, but didn't work very hard at school, much to my great, regret. And going back to role models, because I'm the son of immigrants, we had a small business, and that was pretty much our expectation. But I thought maybe there was something more I could do. I was always looking. I always say when I go around to speak to school children, especially, or students, you have to look beyond your circumstance. Whatever you think, if money were no object, what would you do? And that's what you're here for, basically. It might take years or even decades. In my case, it took 20 years. But I have to say, because of my lack of university education, no money and no background in politics or the professions, I joined the Young Conservatives when I was 18, because I just wanted to get involved and get interested. And then I watched with fascination the 1990 leadership election. And then John Major appeared from nowhere, almost. And I thought, well, he left school at 16. He didn't go to university. Maybe in 20 years I might be able to become a member of Parliament. Now, if I hadn't had seen that, I might have just stayed in the business route, tried to make some money and come back into politics a bit later. But role models are crucial, because without that track to run on, where I saw Young Conservatives, the local Conservative Association, becoming a city councillor, standing for Parliament, I saw that path. And without that, I may not have even bothered to try.
Jade, you mentioned this earlier in terms of, say, the environment in schools. To what extent should this be a formal part of the education system? Michael Gove, when he started his Schools Revolution, attacked the soft bigotry of low expectations. Yes, I can think of, I was chatting to someone the other day, for example, who's a very experienced senior doctor who, during the pandemic, started doing online maths and English mentoring for children in a relatively deprived part of the country. And one of the things that this person had found is they had to struggle with the teachers in that school to encourage them to put the kids in for the higher level maths paper, where your score can go between the equivalent of like A star to C. Yeah. Instead, they were saying, we're going to put them in for a paper where the best you can do is a B. And you say, well, actually, give them a shot, give them a chance. And kids aren't stupid; they pick up whether people have faith in them.
Absolutely. One of the things that always sticks in my mind is when I went for my very first hustings, and it was in a private school. And I was so intimidated because I knew that every boy in that room had lessons in public speaking. Yeah, exactly. And I knew that would be difficult. I really felt that. But luckily, growing up, I had two people who I used to visit, and they were immigrants from Poland. And they constantly pushed it down my throat that if I sat back and didn't actually fight for a better future for people, we would have situations that they'd been in Poland, especially after you had the situation with Derek Hatton. They could actually see the similarities of what they'd witnessed and how war is created and how societies are absolutely ravished. So I was really lucky in that aspect that, again, it boils down to role models. In schools, children are not given the opportunity to do public speaking. They're in schools where they have to teach them how to use a toilet. For example, teachers are changing nappies. We have to look at that, ask why, but also motivate the teachers to actually want to push their children. And also, I would say there needs to be better access for parents who aren't qualified teachers to actually go into the school and help out, because they're the ones with experience. If you've got children who are interested in medicine and you've got a parent who might be a nurse or a doctor, give them children access to these professionals and maybe do a little lesson with them. But that seems to be really frowned upon because the unions do not want unqualified teachers in the education system. So we need to remove that barrier and give better access into our education from people from the outside.
Matthew.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned John Major earlier, and one of the phrases that he often used, which I always quite liked, was when he talked about opportunity for all. I think it's a really good phrase that sums things up. And when we think about the levelling up set of policies, I think it's useful not just to think about it in geographic terms, levelling up certain parts of the country, but also different parts of society and providing opportunities across the country.
Now, we have some questions also coming in from our...
Can I just say,
oh, sorry.
one of the best quotes I heard him say was, the right to own and the power to choose. That's levelling up to me.
And I'll divert briefly from the question from online, because this links into what you were saying earlier about housing. So the value of a job obviously is hugely dictated by the environment. What can you buy with
Well, and where can you live?
The way Conservative Home defined this, I think our editor defined it as good jobs, good homes, and the chance to build good savings, actually being 3 pillars of the conservative society. Does it concern you that we hear a lot of people talking about, for example, ways to address the symptoms of the housing shortage, and there is an obvious political difficulty, dare I say, particularly for Conservatives at times, with the answer of build more houses?
Well, it's clearly a demand issue. You know, it's not just for the Conservative Party or government. For the past few decades, we haven't built enough property. Social housing, council housing, privately owned housing. In my constituency, there's a perfect brownfield site, 400 acres, building a new town on it. A 3-bedroom townhouse is nearly £500,000. How can that be sensible, sustainable, or a sense of reality? I had a situation a year or so ago where, bar one member of my team, they'd all been to university, they'd all worked hard, they'd all done well, they were all living in shared houses. Now, unless you inherit money or win money or buy a lottery ticket, there was no way out of the shared houses. And yet they had 50,000 quid worth of student debt, and they were living in a shared house. What are we offering them?
That's a really interesting point, because developers pretty much do not want to build houses where they're not going to make vast amounts of money. In Liverpool City region, we've got areas where you can buy a home for about £30,000. You know, what can we do to encourage people into these young people, because that's not unaffordable.
No.
You know, how can we make it better and make it more desirable for people to take that chance and jump on the property ladder, knowing that, you know, that area is going to develop and be a better place?
Yeah, and we've done it before. We did it in the Macmillan built, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of houses over, after, to build supply.
Yeah.
And sooner or later, a government's going to have to get to grips with it.
Ideally, before it's a crisis.
Well, it's already a crisis. Try renting a property.
I can hear quite a lot of people online saying evidently insufficient for the government to do it.
It's difficult, but we've got the target of 300,000 new starts a year, which we're getting there. But I might get in trouble for saying this. It needs to be a lot more, and we need to build council housing as well.
Hearing a lot of agreement in the room. So a question from our online audience. What happened to the nation of shopkeepers? Napoleon's insult, if I recall correctly. Are SMEs being fairly treated? We have a similar question. How important are thriving high streets for jobs and enterprise? And can we cut business rates? Matthew, let's start with you on this one.
We still are a nation of shopkeepers, aren't we? And I referred to some polling earlier, and lots of support for SMEs, for startups, for entrepreneurs in society, and that's something which we need to build on. And sometimes with the government, when it sends out signals like saying it will increase corporation tax, that almost sends out a signal it doesn't really want to encourage entrepreneurship or encourage enterprise and business. So I hope that's one of the things that the government will look into later on in the year. Of course, we've got the PM's speech going up with Rishi Sunak on the economy, state of the economy. We saw a sort of forerunner of that in I think it was in The Sun at the weekend, wasn't it? Their joint article talking about the economy. And I was pleased to see in that they were talking about cutting business taxes, which could be a good thing. But yes, the seeds for any good economy come from having a strong entrepreneurial sector and lots of SMEs.
Jade, to develop that theme a little bit, somebody pointed out to me the other day that actually SME is also a generational issue. The development of the side hustle, the way it's described to me recently was, if you think about it, every single Instagram influencer is an SME or a sole trader. Often disregarded actually as a huge growth sector. We were hearing earlier about the huge, the huge growth potential of job creation from SMEs. Is that something that you're seeing on the ground in Liverpool City region? Is it something, and how can the government act more productively to help to spur it to grow?
It's certainly a growing sector, but it's not a visible one. I think people working from home and, you know, maybe producing small goods and selling them on Facebook and Instagram, things like that. It's not visible to everybody. But what I would say about, you know, the traditional sense of a shopkeeper, they need to be supported by the councils. Like, our council is an absolute disgrace for supporting small businesses. They won't empty the bins for them. You know, they have to get private contractors. They won't clean the streets outside the shops. They won't support small businesses with action if there's a messy building next door. And these are the things that the councils really need to get to grips with, and they're just not prepared to do it at the moment. So I would say that government needs to, you know, take action on the councils that aren't supporting those local businesses.
Jack, is it possible does it need centralising to override kind of local government failure, or is it something that we need to kind of devolve and expect local areas to, say, compete with each other for the incentives of spurring business?
Well, I mean, we are still a nation of small business people and shopkeepers. A lot of people forget that, you know, the small businesses of today are the bigger employers in the future, which are going to pay wages and tax and everything else. And the government's done a lot to support small businesses. I was just looking at some stats, so I'm not going to bother to read them all out to you. But there is a general, talking about the high street, I'm sorry to go back to housing again. I think high street should be more mixed in the sense that people could work and live and shop in the same areas. And that would help with connectivity as well. That's how I see the future of the high street.
Now, before I go to another online question, just going to check if anyone in the room has a hand creeping up. Question here. Oh, sorry. I've ambushed our roving microphone by going the furthest distance possible for it to travel.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Drew Smith from Zoom. A bit of a self-interested question, because we've not sort of talked about how the world of work has changed or been changed by kind of the last 2 years, and the necessary shift onto sort of more virtual meetings and the ability for people and enterprises to hire from a larger kind of geographic area that's precipitated. So I just wondered to the panel, to what extent should kind of the growth of flexible working be part of the party's policy towards jobs, you know, going into the next election?
Matthew, I spoke to someone the other day from a really major multinational. I asked exactly this question. They said, well, it's great, we don't relocate anybody anymore. We can hire far more people who would otherwise say, I don't want to uproot my life, don't want to uproot my family. We get a better talent pool, and we don't have to pay any of the costs of uprooting their lives and persuading them to travel across the world.
I benefit from the flexibility of hybrid working. I like it, but I can see the downsides as well. I can see the fact that in the different workplaces where I consult with, some of the younger members of staff don't get the mentorship from more senior members of staff they used to get. I see in meetings, which when you have hybrid meetings, where you have, yes, half the meeting with people physically in the room and some people on Zoom or Teams or something else, then the meeting comes to a formal end, but it basically carries on with just people in the room. So there are downsides too, but yes, the flexibility is good.
Jade?
I would say it's going to cause an issue in a society where we're trying to get more people to do apprenticeships. You cannot do an apprenticeship sitting in a room by yourself. So I can see issues with that, particularly in engineering. You know, I'm from an engineering background myself. There's no way I could have partook in my field of expertise at home. I think there needs to be a strong balance.
Jack, how do we make the most of, you know, capitalising on the upsides of this while
Well,
retaining?
I'm not sure it's something that the government should always, you know, have to have a view on or a policy. I was always a very reluctant virtual worker. Even in the beginning of the pandemic, I sort of walked to my office in the constituency every day and spent my life on the telephone. But eventually, I got onto Zoom and all Teams and all that stuff. And I was glad when we went back to some sort of normal. But having said that, I've embraced it as far as, you know, I get a constituency Friday. I try and fit as much as I can in. You know, if I can minimise some of the travelling by doing stuff online, people dialing in for surgery appointments, mutually convenient for people who, you know, don't want to travel in to see my office. So, yeah, I think it's already happening. And I think it's all about the flexibility. But obviously, I like being in front of people, but even though I know that isn't always possible, the most efficient way of doing it. Jade, you talked about apprenticeships again. I know Airbus and Rolls-Royce did manage to continue with their apprenticeship program. Obviously, it was hugely challenging, but they managed to complete and continue with what they were doing. But yeah, so I think that it's already changed. People have embraced the flexibility of it, but I don't want to see it go too far one way or the other.
I think where it really does help is getting women working. Obviously, we've got an absolute childcare nightmare at the moment. So if businesses can write that into their employment policies, that, you know, I don't know how parents manage their children during the time of working from home, it might be, you know, something worth considering.
It's a really important point. I know we have another question in the audience I'll go to in just a moment, but that, much like housing, when you talk to people about their decision to be able to enter the workforce, or when they do enter the workforce, whether they're able to work as many hours as they would like, childcare is one of those things that comes up over and over again. Obviously, the government's taking some action on that, as we've announced this week. Is there a case for something, for example, like making childcare a tax-deductible expense? If it literally is something that enables someone to enter the workforce, is that something the Treasury ought to look at?
Well, I mean, there's always a case for making provision for this or that, but it's obviously, as I said earlier, it's a very difficult balancing act, isn't it? Obviously, you want to empower as many people as possible to be able to make the choices, work and contribute, but all these things have a cost, and it's very difficult. So I know, because I've got my wife and I have a 5-year-old, both members of Parliament, you know, there are times when it's very difficult. But as I say, it's always easy to say the government need to have this policy or intervene. It isn't always a case for that. I think sympathetic employers have a role to play. Our son came to Parliament creche, which worked for us during the week, but it's still extremely difficult, so I understand.
Matthew, is that something that's come up in your research in terms of the kind of action that employers can take for, you know, facilitating workers?
We haven't asked about that, but as a parent with 2 kids at nursery, I would love that policy in a slightly sort of self-indulgent way.
I have to declare my own interest. I have one in nursery.
Yeah, I would love it. It's always struck me that childcare has been one of those issues that actually all the parties have overlooked. And becoming a parent in recent years with a 2- and 4-year-old, you actually see how your life hugely changes when you have kids. And I could see actually the big premium in the party having a strong policy in this area and actually helping people at that stage in their lives.
And electorally speaking, we normally see the statistical analysis after a general election. What is the tipping point age at which somebody moves from typically voting Labour to voting Tory? And obviously the lower that age is, the more likely the Tories are to win the election. That's not just a function, is it? People at either end of the age group. It's actually what's going on in your life, in your, say, between the ages of 25 and 45, when you're transitioning in your career or hoping to gain a home, but also being able to incorporate, being able to have a family if you wish.
And all the issues you talked about today, so yes, childcare, housing, paying off student debt, all those come together, so that crucial years of the sort of late 20s, 30s, early 40s, where it goes up and down the continuum, those are the big issues.
I think perhaps we'd also benefit from taking more of a traditional conservative family stance on things, and you know supporting households with 2 parents, give some kind of positive viewpoint of one staying at home and looking after their children as well, because I think we always forget that society doesn't have to be this. Women have everything, and they go to work and they have their children, and they let's look at traditional values as well, and perhaps put some support in place.
And ways to incorporate that, for example, with things like shared parental leave.
Yeah.
For that
Continue that.
Now, I think the question was just here in the middle. I think this will have to be our last question, unless anybody has a quick question. Have a ponder about it.
Hello, my name's Richard Diamond. I'm from Bexley in southeast London. I'm going to break your rule and say my question is based on a comment experience.
As long as there's a question mark at the end of it.
There is a question, and how we break out of this circle. Having been involved, admittedly local experience in a by-election 6 months ago, and having successfully thought a council seat, or rethought a council seat a couple of months ago, The biggest problem, we can talk to a blue in the face about policy, but my experience on the doorstep is we have an electorate that is very cynical about politicians actually delivering. And we saw, both in the by-election and in our local elections, despite winning in both cases, masses of Conservatives just not prepared to come out. How do we convince our core supporters, let alone other people, that we're actually going to deliver on the things we're talking about, have the best policies in the world, but people are very sceptical about whether they'll be delivering? Just heard with Jack's comments about housing, we've got this debate about, are we going to get the 40 hospitals, are we going to deliver the GPs we promised, and things like that. It's how are we going to convince people, with all these ideas we've got, we're actually going to be able to deliver on them.
You very kindly circled us right round to my opening remarks at the start, which is precisely when people step out. You know, that kind of Ben Houchin Tees Valley story of whether people can't eat a press release, I think, as they say there. Actually, people being able to step out of their house, look around and see material change. The one thing I'd add to that question, is there time before the next election, given how much time's been stolen from the government by the pandemic? Is there time to make that material change in sufficient quantity by the next election? Jeff?
Yes, I think so. I don't pick up that degree of cynicism. I knock on doors regularly, as you would imagine, and live in my constituency. There is, I think, a frustration from time to time. Council decisions, their local environment, local police force. You know, you do pick up frustrations. Well, I wouldn't say a cynicism, to be fair. And ultimately, you know, all of us will be judged on our records. You know, things we've promised, the things we said we'd achieve for our local area, and when the choice is to be made. So yes, there is time, but I think, you know, I could do the typical politicians thing and list all the things we've done since 2019, but I'm not going to do that. But I'm confident that come the moment of decision, you know, we will be able to demonstrate, you know, a good track record of delivery.
Jade?
Yeah, I do think we've got time to deliver, but you've got to make sure that people actually want things to be done, because often with these things, people are cynical because they're negative about it themselves. We need to make sure that people are positive and genuinely want that change and want to actually be part of that change, because politicians can't do anything by themselves. So wider society has to make that change with them and take it forward.
Thank you. Matthew?
As part of the research I've been doing a number of focus groups across the country, and I've been quite struck by actually when you speak to the listen to what voters are thinking, they recognise actually the challenges the governments face, not just with COVID, but also now Ukraine and inflation, and actually recognise the external factors that have affected things since the election. One thing I would say is that, you know, people like to see politicians with a plan. And when they think about Keir Starmer, they actually say he doesn't have a plan. That's one of the key reasons why they don't rate the Labour Party at the moment. I think what an important moment coming up when we have this joint speech on the economy. What is the government's plan? Bringing all the different strands of all the different policy areas together to their plan for the economy. That's a really important point to show there's that plan there.
Well, I think on that note, that brings us to a natural closing point. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming along. Thank you for listening and for your questions. Thank you to all of you, those of you at home who've been sending in questions and viewing online. We're going to take a short break for tea and coffee. We'll be back at 11 o'clock for our keynote speech by Nadine Zahawi, the Secretary of State for Education. But before you escape, please give a warm round of applause to our panel.
Thank you for having us. Appreciate it.